Hi, everyone. This is Tori Vandelin with Prevent Connect. This is part 2 of our podcast on working with the media. Ashley and I are joined again by Carissa Gutierrez and Jess Atkinson. This time, they share their favorite tips and resources for preventionists and communicators alike.
I think some of the tips that you just gave are really helpful, but what would you say, so if someone asks us a question, has a request for some type of statement, or we have an opportunity for an interview, should we write down what we should say? Should we share that with people so they can help us kind of, draw down the important points? What would you say that process should look like in getting to a concise, easy to understand message?
It depends on the request or the opportunity, because the message is important, yes, and the talking points are important, but who is the messenger as well? There are so many things to consider when we are responding to a message, and who is the person that's responding is just as important. So at times, as Jess mentioned before, being able to field an interview to a local agency is a great opportunity for us to, a better way, a more effective way of telling a story when it's the advocate themselves who's able to do it. And we don't want that person to feel unsupported in their ability to respond to an interview request. So providing talking points, as Jess mentioned, is so important. And at the same time, allowing space for that person to present their story, to present their experience, I think is balanced in that response. So as much as it is some prep work and being able to address these are the key points that we want to get across in this interview or as a response to this question, there also needs to be this room for authenticity and sincerity. And that's, I think, incredibly important for me, is who's the person that can speak to their experience, and that it, in and of itself, be the hook. We don't need to talk about the details. We don't need to talk about how we do our work, but we need to really speak to the passion and what drives us to do the work that we do. And this is where something like a mission statement or a consistent vision statement really does fit in pretty well, as sort of, this is the entry point. Tell us more about you and the work that you do.
Absolutely. And I would say also, when we get a request in, again, you're saying it really depends, what is the request? Who is it coming from? Who is the audience? So when we get a request in, we have a pool of, and specifically media requests, we have a pool of, say, 10 BARC staffers who are media trained. And so depending on what the topic of the request is, then I think okay, who really has the most expertise and grounding in the more specific topic? And then it's reaching out to them, and we develop those talking points, but then what they can bring to it is their own personal experience. So when we have a clinician who is speaking about the impacts of sexual trauma on a person, they can say the talking points that I've written down, isolation, blame, self-blame. But then they can speak to, if I'm working with a survivor, this is how I go about working on those issues. So they can really give them the human side of it. And whether it's a clinician or one of our educators, they can say, when we're in one of our trainings, this is how we approach that. Or our legislative person can talk about how the fact that the local GSA was talking about how the state of their sex ed curriculum was really impacting their experience in high school, and they didn't feel like they were getting the consent education that they needed. They can tell those more personal stories that really feed into the talking points, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it's super important to think about who is the messenger, how are we boiling stuff down, but then what both of you had shared about, how are we making room for people to share their own stories too. I feel like I don't feel like it's been told to me by many people many times that I'm a very wordy person. I try to go for comprehensive with everything. And that may not necessarily be the best way to have these stories of prevention or, you know, ways to engage communities really be the most effective. So I know that I've learned a lot from both of you just in previous conversations and in the conversation that we're having right now. But I want to hear more if you all have other tangible tips or resources for folks who may be new to messaging, you know, prevention folks who maybe haven't done this sort of like how do we talk to folks outside of the field and get it to stick kind of work. Or on the other side of that, people who are really involved in the communications field but who are new to sexual violence prevention. What should they know? What are your like fast facts or fast tips for them?
You know, you've already mentioned it before, Tori, is the Berkeley Media Studies Group has done great work as far as creating toolkits and providing so many different resources for communicators or the media at large to better understand the way we currently frame issues around sexual violence and what we could be improving upon to tell that story. I think one of the challenges and opportunities I see with communicators coming into this field or individuals in this field who want to become communicators is this concept of prevention that you brought up. It's like, what does prevention look like? I think was my first question when I first started. And they're like, oh, well, it's, you know, after school programs, it's this, it's the other. And for me, I needed someone to make that connection of how does this prevent sexual violence? And so to really do that is to understand what causes sexual violence. So there needs to be more than just room for the development of communications plans or communication strategies or messaging grids or talking points. There needs to be sort of a fundamental or basic understanding of the root causes of violence and allowing room for that, for space for that, to understand how our movement intersects with other movements like racial justice issues, like environmental justice or reproductive justice, is what will strengthen your messaging as a communicator. To see the connection with our movement with others, I think is what strengthens the work that we do. So I would say that would probably be one of my number one tips would be see your movement not as a silo, but really as one more path that converges with the others. And I think that would ultimately help you. And also, yes, look to the experts, look to the individuals who've been doing this work, what works, what doesn't work, what type of framing works. Surround yourself with other communicators. More often than not, we're the only communicators in our organizations. So being a part of certain organizations, there are communicators networks. There are some specific to our movement, but plugging in as much as possible to create your community is also something I would suggest.
Yeah, and I would just echo everything that Carissa just said. Definitely connecting with other communicators in this field has been essential for me because, I mean, I'm actually being a dedicated communications person at a local rape crisis center is actually very unique and a luxury. I would say that in most local rape crisis centers, there's maybe a person who has communications as one of like 3 different things that they are responsible for. So it's been really important for me to connect with other people who are doing that in local rape crisis centers, but also just connecting with other communicators in the nonprofit field has been invaluable. One other tip I would add, just for, I would say like newcomers to messaging and like to media work, I would say like one very simple tip is like, you don't have to focus on what someone else wants you to focus on. Like say you're in an interview and they ask you a question and you're like, oh God, that is not a good framing for that question. Like you can say, I totally understand why you're asking that question. And what's really important to focus on for us is blah, 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 what you actually want to say. That is a tip that I always do in my training with staffers. And that has proved very valuable for them because, you know, media is part of our culture and you're going to get some not great questions or questions that are just like besides the point that we want to get out there. And so that's always a useful tip that I try to pass along.
I love that with flipping the frame, because I feel like that is one of my hesitations with working with or engaging with media, is like, oh no. And I know, Ashley, it's something you and I tell people when we prep them for our podcast, like, we're not gotcha, we're not gotcha podcasters. We're here to have a conversation, like you all had said earlier, in this podcast, that really treat it like a conversation. So I think just hearing that, like, it's okay and it's normal to flip the frame of the question, or redirect folks, like we do all the time in prevention programming.
Mhm.
It's very comforting and reduces some of that fear for me.
Yeah, Tori, I totally agree. And I think that learning how to pivot is such an important skill. And, I actually really appreciate when that happens, when we're doing either a podcast or a web conference, because like you said, you're talking to the experts. And so if you, as like the person interviewing or facilitating, are going down a line that's actually not the story and not the important piece, like, I want that reframing. I want to know, like, what should we be talking about? What should we be thinking about? So I really appreciate that as well. I have a really quick question. And Carissa, I feel like you have said this a couple of times, and I just don't know what it is. So I'm wondering if you would just share a little bit. What is a messaging grid?
Oh, I apologize. So some of these, I think what's great about communications is that it's a skill set that people can learn, and it's a skill set that's translatable across different industries, platforms, or areas. So within our field, within the anti-gender based violence or anti-sexual violence world, there are a lot of skills that do translate for communicators. And a messaging grid is just one more tool. So what it is in line with a communications plan, which is another term that's thrown out a lot, that really captures a lot of those core messages or strategies when it comes to communications at an organization. A messaging grid is a grid, and where you've outlined or identified some of your major audiences or people that you reach out to on one side. So you have your community members, you have survivors, for us, perhaps you have policymakers, you have, you can move your way out into who is that primary or secondary or tertiary audience that you're trying to reach. And then on the other side is, what is the message? Is it prevention? Is it intervention? Is it an upcoming event? It really changes. And based on the audience, as this grid comes through, is how are you telling a similar story in the language that can be better received by the audience you're speaking to? So you end up with all these different permutations or different versions of the same message, but delivered in the way that your audience will be able to receive it and respond to it. And that is a sort of activity. It isn't always a messaging grid per se, but it's the activity of being able to think, here is what I'm trying to promote. How do I need to phrase it so that the person I'm trying to reach understands what I'm trying to say? And it's just a lot of tweaking sometimes. It's speaking to their motivations, but it is an exercise that many of us can do to do that more effectively. So we may start out with a basic message and then just make some of those tweaks to make sure that the right audience is receiving it the right way.
And I think like one really simple example of how that works is like when we look at the phrase sexual violence. So if we're talking to other coalitions and service providers and rape crisis centers, sexual violence, they're going to know what that is in half a second, because that's what we do all the time. When we're talking to like the general public, and there's been studies on this with the Berkeley Media Studies group, sexual violence might have a very different connotation. And so what might actually be more effective language, and has shown to be more effective, is like showing that there is the range of behaviors, but not using the word violence, because people have certain ideas about what violence is and what violence looks like. So instead saying sexual assault, harassment, and abuse, or something like that.
Got it. Thank you both so much for clarifying that. I love anything that is a tool or a practice that can, kind of help us build those skills like you mentioned.
Thanks for listening. There was so much more we talked about in our conversation with Carissa and Jess, so stay tuned for more parts of this podcast coming in future Prevent Connect monthly newsletters.